Let's dive into this history. Where the blade sleeps. The rain whispered against the windows like a lullaby for the lost. Inside the post station, the fire cracked softly, its glow casting tired shadows across the worn wooden floor. Wood creaked under every shift of weight. The smell of ash, damp wool, and forgotten ink lingered in the room, thick as the memories no one dared voice aloud. Matthias sat in the corner, untouched tea cooling in his hands. He hadn't moved for what felt like hours, not since the letter had arrived. It had come with no return address. Folded crisply, placed in a simple wax-sealed envelope. The script on the front, clean, old-fashioned, almost ceremonial. Inside, a single line. Dein Schwertwort in still. Your blade waits in silence. The ink had bled slightly into the page, perhaps from moisture. Or perhaps the letter had waited a long time to be delivered. He stared at it again. There was something in those words. Not threat. Not invitation. A calling, ancient and quiet, like footsteps behind you that you can't quite hear. Along with the letter came a map fragment. Faded. Yellowed at the corners. The edges torn as if by fire or time. Most of it was blank, save for one portion, a winding path through dense wood, a black mark in the shape of a crest, a sigil. He recognized it instantly. The same crest that adorned the family ring of his grandfather, a mark once worn with pride, then buried in silence. As a boy, Matthias had listened to his grandfather's stories about a knight, a distant ancestor, who'd ridden with a Teutonic unit during the chaos of the 30 Years' War. A man who vanished into the forests near Waldeck, and never returned. Just a legend, they'd said. But this map, this letter, this moment felt like more than myth. It felt like inheritance. In another part of town, behind the tall iron-framed windows of the regional library, Jonas turned another page with care. The historian's fingers were long and dusted with graphite, his glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of his nose. He had been combing through old military records for weeks. Something wasn't adding up. A unit, 20 men, dispatched from Mittenwald to secure a route through Waldeck. No battle was recorded. No retreat. No burial. And yet, no one had ever declared them missing. Instead, the records simply stopped. Like someone had pressed a quill to the page and decided silence was safer than truth. He leaned back, exhaled. Then he saw it, in the margin of a torn field report, a small, uneven sketch. A crest, barely visible, but hauntingly familiar. A stylized cross woven with thorns. He flipped back through his notes. Where had he seen it before? He didn't yet know the answer would arrive later that night. The tavern was warm. Low ceilings, creaking beams, and the faint scent of cloves and roasted onion from the kitchen. Rain pattered softly on the windows, muffling the hush of tired conversations. Matthias sat near the hearth, his map fragment spread beside his drink. He traced the edge absently, thoughts somewhere between past and present. Jonas entered moments later, eyes scanning for a quiet table. The only empty seat was across from Matthias. He asked. Matthias nodded. They sat in silence for a while. But silence has weight, and eventually it broke. Jonas's eyes landed on the map. That crest, he said, almost to himself. Matthias followed his gaze. You've seen it? In a journal, Jonas replied, carefully opening his book. A dispatch from the 1630s. A unit that vanished near Waldeck. No record of where. Or why. Matthias looked at the book, then back at his map. The crest matched perfectly. This belonged to my grandfather's grandfather, he said. He said we came from a knight who vanished in the woods. I always thought it was a fairy tale. Maybe it is, Jonas said. Or maybe some stories survive because they're waiting to be finished. They sat in the growing quiet. Outside, the rain softened to mist. Later that night, Matthias packed slowly. Every motion felt deliberate, like closing chapters written in someone else's hand. His coat was worn. His boots still bore the mud of battlefields far away. But this journey felt different. Not a campaign. A reckoning. At the door stood Jonas, holding a lantern. I know the region, he said. But not that path. Still, if you'll have me. Matthias met his eyes. I don't know where it leads. But if my ancestor fell there, then I'll go. For memory. Not revenge. Jonas nodded. As they stepped into the night, the wind shifted. And somewhere, in a place long buried by mapmakers, a silence stirred, because someone had finally heard it. The village was still sleeping when they left. Morning mist hung low, silvering the grass with dew. The sky was the color of paper yet to be written on, and the only sounds were boots on damp earth and the whisper of branches swaying in slow rhythm. Matthias walked slightly ahead, his shoulders tense beneath his coat, while Jonas followed in steady silence. They said little on the way to the monastery of St. Oswald. But words weren't needed. Maps have memory, Jonas finally said, as they crossed a narrow stone bridge over a half-dried stream. They fade, they change, but the oldest ones, the true ones, don't give themselves up so easily. You can't just look. You have to ask. Matthias only nodded. The monastery stood on the edge of the forest like a thought someone had tried to forget. Weathered stones, crooked windows, and a narrow bell tower that leaned just slightly eastward, as if listening to the trees. The monks didn't speak when the two men arrived, only nodded, offered bread and water, and let them pass. Brother Theobald met them at the steps leading down to the archives. A man built like an autumn tree, thin, gnarled, yet strangely strong. You seek a road that no longer exists? He asked quietly. Others have come with that same question. Not all returned. He handed them a rusted key, then stepped aside. The archive room breathed dust. Old wood shelves lined the stone walls, stacked with scrolls, parchments, and folded skins. The air was thick with candle wax, old ink, and time. A single high window let in just enough gray light to cast everything in sepia. Jonas moved with reverence. He lit a small oil lamp, then slowly began to unroll scroll after scroll across a long central table. Matthias stood at a distance, uneasy. He wasn't trained for this world. He didn't know how to read the curl of roads, or the faded signatures of cartographers. But something in the room pulled at him. Memory? Destiny? He couldn't say. Then a line. A familiar one. He leaned closer. I've seen this before. Jonas paused. Where? Matthias pointed. On my grandfather's spur. It was etched there, faint, nearly invisible. Jonas narrowed his eyes and gently turned the scroll toward him. The map was centuries old, nearly crumbling at the edges, but in the lower right corner there it was. VR. Jonas read aloud, softly. Verlorener Ritter. The Lost Knight. That's not a place, Matthias said, voice hoarse. That's a title. A code name, Jonas nodded. A unit. 10 men. Sent south, toward the pass beyond Waldeck. And never seen again. They studied the route. It wound through a series of defunct roads, some marked as unstable, others simply erased from later editions. Landslides. Bog. Fog. Dangerous terrain. But near one sharp curve in the path, written in faded Gothic script. Here liegt das Eisen, das nicht zerbrach. Here lies the iron that did not break. Matthias sat down slowly. Not from exhaustion. From something heavier. That's him, he whispered. That's about him. Jonas didn't interrupt. He reached for another scroll, this one wrapped in newer parchment. When he opened it, the air in the room shifted. The same region. A newer map. But one detail was gone. A cave, marked on the ancient scroll, had been erased. Cleanly. Precisely. Jonas tapped the spot. This was hidden. Someone didn't want that place found. Inside the scroll's wrapping, something metallic shifted. A pin, old, tarnished, but intact, fell out onto the table. An emblem. A simple Latin inscription carved into its surface. Memoria Mene. Memory remains. Matthias picked it up. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, his eyes didn't burn with grief or anger. Only purpose. If I don't find the sword, he said quietly, then I'll find what became of them. I owe them that much. The light had faded by the time they left the archives. Wind moved through the narrow window, flickering the lamp flame and sending a loose parchment floating gently to the floor. Time didn't pass in that room, it waited. In his chamber that night, Matthias sat by the window, staring into the dark line of forest just beyond the monastery walls. Stars had begun to appear, faint and few. Jonas leaned against the frame, arms crossed, saying nothing. Finally, Matthias broke the silence. I thought I needed to find a blade. He exhaled, almost smiling. But maybe it's not me looking for the sword. Maybe the sword's been looking for me. Jonas tilted his head. Or, he said, it's looking for someone who will finally write the end of its story. Matthias didn't answer. But he didn't look away. And in the dark, the blade of memory stirred once more. The road narrowed as they moved southwest, the land rising into low, rolling hills that blurred into the base of darker peaks beyond. On the third day, after a night spent near a ruined forge swallowed by vines, they approached the edge of the old forest. Jonas stopped before the tree line. His voice was low, hesitant. This is it. Der Stammhain. The silent grove. Matthias looked ahead. The trees were tall and old, limbs heavy with moss, their trunks wrapped in bark like weathered skin. The air beyond the threshold was unnaturally still. Even the wind, which had followed them all morning, seemed to stop at the border. A forest without birdsong, Jonas continued. It's in the old records. Messengers avoided it. Pilgrims cut around it. But it's the only path to the pass. Matthias gave a single nod. Then we go. They stepped beneath the canopy. At once, the sound of the world changed. No chirping insects. No rustling leaves. Only the dull crunch of boots on a forest floor thick with years of fallen needles. A mist coiled low around their ankles, blurring their steps. It clung to them, to the roots, to the trunks, and moved like it remembered how to haunt. And then they saw them. The stones. Dozens of them, rising from the moss like forgotten teeth. Carved, uncarved, broken, smooth, all silent. All facing the same direction. East. Matthias slowed his pace. They're not graves. No, Jonas said, crouching near one. They're markers. But not religious. Look, no crosses, no prayers. He raised his lantern. Only then did the inscriptions become visible. FG 1636. My. HM 1636. My. Each stone bore a name. Or at least initials. And a date. May. 1636. Jonas stood, more carefully now. This is when they disappeared. Matthias walked on, following the line of stones. The mist thickened ahead, but he didn't slow. Then he stopped, hand pressed to one particular stone. The moss was heavier here, green-gray and damp. He scraped it back with his gloved thumb. "Gr." Matthias didn't speak. His breath caught in his throat. For a long time, he simply stared. "My grandfather told me stories," he said finally. "Of Gerhard von Reichenau. A knight. Said he died on a road that didn't exist anymore." Jonas came closer, but kept his distance. The air had shifted, from mystery to mourning. "If this is him," he asked quietly, "then why is the sword still missing?" Matthias shook his head. "Maybe he didn't fall in battle. Maybe he left it behind. On purpose." They made camp beneath two twisted trees, a short distance from the stones. The fire was small, just enough for warmth. Jonas scribbled notes by lamplight. Matthias sat across from him, staring at the flames like they held answers he couldn't quite reach. As night deepened, the silence thickened. Not peaceful, hollow. At some point, Jonas stirred from sleep. A sound had woken him. Not a branch. Not an animal. Metal. A single, soft clink. He rose slowly. The stones stood as they had, except one. One had fallen. He crossed to it. Beyond, half buried in the roots, something gleamed. Jonas brushed away soil. A silver button. He turned it over, heart racing. Etched into the surface, 2 crossed swords over a lily. The same crest Matthias had shown him from a page in his family archive. A symbol of the lost unit. Of legacy. He returned to camp and woke Matthias with a touch. The soldier's eyes opened, then widened as Jonas placed the button in his hand. Matthias held it like a pulse. Like something still alive. They were here, he whispered. All the way here. But they didn't leave, Jonas said. Or they couldn't. By morning the mist began to lift. But not completely. The forest, even in daylight, felt unfinished. As they packed, Jonas noticed something on the horizon, a dark shape behind a line of trees. Not natural. Too square. They moved toward it cautiously. Through thinning fog, a structure emerged. A squat, sunken tower. Almost completely overgrown. Half its stones crumbled into earth. One arched window, empty. One iron door, slightly ajar. Matthias stepped forward, slowly. This isn't on the map. No, Jonas said. This was hidden. They stood before it. Silent. Listening. Even now, no birds sang. The doorway yawned like a wound. Cold air moved from within. Jonas adjusted his coat. We wanted answers. Matthias nodded once. The silver button still in his hand. Maybe this is where they start. Or end. Then they stepped inside. And the stones behind them watched, unmoving. At the edge of the forest, where the trees leaned with the weight of age and mist curled like sleeping breath, stood a tower, tall, narrow, and covered in ivy. It rose from the earth like a forgotten thought, part ruin, part riddle. Matthias and Jonas paused several paces away, surveying it in silence. It doesn't look damaged, Jonas finally said. Just closed. There were no windows below. No doors. Just stone, weathered, veined with moss, and as smooth as bone. Higher up, just beneath the edge of the roof, a single slit of darkness broke the otherwise impenetrable wall. That's not an oversight, Matthias muttered. It was meant to be sealed. Jonas moved closer, brushing ivy from the wall. Beneath the leaves, a carving emerged, a circle split by a cross. His breath caught. This is a Teutonic mark. Opus clausum ad reditum. Sealed until return. Matthias stared. But no one returned. By dusk they were building a way in. Jonas fashioned a rope ladder from salvaged cord and branches, fastening it against the tower with stone wedges and knots he learned during an archaeological dig. The work was slow. The forest watched in silence. When it was ready, Matthias volunteered to climb. I carry the name, he said. If something waits, it waits for me. He climbed slowly. The rope groaned. Fingers brushed cold stone. Halfway up he paused, not from fear, but from something older. Reverence. As if each stone held a whisper, and he was stepping into a chorus of long-buried voices. At the top, he grasped a narrow edge and pulled himself up. The opening led into a square chamber, modest in size, circular in feel. He lit his lantern and stepped inside. Dust clung to every surface, yet the room didn't feel abandoned. A bench sat against the far wall. A woolen blanket lay folded, brittle, but intact. On the floor, a candle stub, slightly melted, wick charred black. Matthias's footsteps stirred no echo. The silence was absolute. Jonas soon joined him, breathing hard from the climb. The two men scanned the room with careful eyes. In the far corner, beneath a shelf, rested a chest. Old. Wooden. Latched but not locked. Matthias opened it slowly. Inside. A dented flask, tarnished silver, GR carved into its surface. A strip of stiff leather, bearing the crest of 2 crossed swords and a lily. And a journal. Jonas reached for it, his hands almost reverent. The cover cracked like old bark as he opened it. Inside, ink-lined fragile pages and flowing script. But something felt wrong. He read aloud. May 19, 1636. We wait. We do not proceed. The road. He paused. That's it. The sentence ends mid-word. He tilted the page to the light. The ink. It's too fresh. This shouldn't have survived nearly 400 years like this. Matthias held the flask in both hands. He didn't need confirmation. He could feel it, through the metal, through his blood. It's his. Jonas knelt, examining the chest's interior. Beneath the journal, folded against the lining, was another note, in a different hand. Rougher. Less practiced. Newer. He read it softly. Whoever reads this remembers. Do not return unless ready to remember all. Then a breeze. Soft. Impossible. There were no open windows. No draft. But air moved around them, unsettling the dust, swirling it upward like breath exhaled from stone. Then, as if nudged by unseen fingers, the candle flickered and lit. The wick hissed briefly. Then glowed. Jonas and Matthias both froze. This tower, Jonas said, voice hollow. It's not abandoned. It's awake. Matthias didn't speak. His hand closed tighter around the flask. Then he whispered, This isn't a place on the map. It's a place in memory. And someone, or something, has been waiting to be remembered. They didn't speak much that night. They sat in the tower, the candle burning low, casting long shadows against the stones. The journal lay open. The leather strip sat between them like a line neither would cross just yet. At dawn, Matthias stood. He approached the chest again, gazed at the journal. Then, gently, placed it back inside. I can't take it with me, he said. Not yet. But I know now, they didn't vanish. They chose to stop. To wait. He turned to Jonas. Some roads don't lead forward. Some wait for someone who remembers how to walk them. Jonas gave a quiet nod. They descended together. The forest was still, but different. And above them, the tower remained, silent, sealed. But no longer empty. The landscape changed by the hour. The trees thinned. The earth grew softer, spongier beneath their boots. Water crept into every hollow, reflecting the heavy gray of the sky above. The world had turned quiet, not in the way of peace, but of absence. As if even the wind had grown cautious here. Jonas scanned the horizon, reading the damp terrain like a worn page. This is it, he murmured. Der versunken Grund. The drowned ground. He pointed to a faded line on the oldest map. The original military route passed through here. But after the flood in 1638, the entire region became marshland. The new maps rerouted the road. But the old one still exists, under water, under memory. Matthias nodded. And they walked forward. The stillness was uncanny. Every step sank slightly, the mud sucking gently at their soles. Reeds swayed, but there was no wind. Shallow pools rippled without cause. The color of the world had dulled, the greens grayed, the sky blank, the trees pale and brittle as old bones. Even their voices came out quieter than intended, as if sound itself didn't want to carry here. Then Matthias stopped. He crouched near a patch of earth where the grass was broken, pressed flat. A footprint. Deep. Wide. The pattern unmistakably from an old-style military boot. Not a replica. Not modern. A real, practical, heavy-soled marcher's print. Jonas knelt beside him. It's old? He asked. Matthias shook his head slowly. Not even a day. Maybe hours. The edges are clean. They exchanged a look. Someone was walking this path ahead of them. Someone wearing a soldier's boots from another century. They followed the trail for nearly a mile, moving between broken stone markers and shallow trenches that may once have been roads. Then, the footprints changed. Grew lighter. Sank less. And then stopped entirely. Matthias circled the last visible print. They should keep going. The mud's the same, wet, consistent. But it's like they vanished, Jonas said. Just lifted away. Or they turned back. But where are those prints? There were none. Jonas looked out over the waterlogged plain. Maybe this ground forgets things it doesn't want remembered. In a gully, Matthias spotted a half-buried hunk of rusted metal. He pulled it free, a wheel axle, long corroded, the iron flaking. Jonas cleaned a patch with his sleeve. Beneath the rust, barely visible, the crest, 2 swords over a lily. Same as the badge. Same as the button. Matthias didn't speak. Further ahead, he found another button, newer, intact. It lay in the mud as if it had just been dropped. Evening began to fall, slow and cold. The marsh gave way to the ruins of an old path. Stones crumbled, half swallowed by water and moss. They made camp near what might once have been a bridge. A row of broken supports rose like teeth from the fog. Trees loomed to the west, their reflections broken in the black water. Jonas gathered reeds and driftwood. Matthias built a fire, small but steady. For a while, they sat in silence, listening to the faint bubbling of mud, the occasional splash far away. Then Matthias stood. "I'll check the perimeter." He didn't wait for a reply. He walked toward a crooked willow growing at the water's edge. Something fluttered in its branches. A strip of cloth, dark, rough, torn. He reached up and took it. Wool. Old but damp. He looked down. Near the roots, something metallic stuck out of the mud. A bayonet tip. He knelt and pulled. The metal was blackened with age, but the engraving was fresh. Scratched by hand. Ich bin Nackta. I am still here. He closed his hand around it. Not from fear, but from recognition. A message not meant to scare, but to confirm. Someone had been here. Someone who still was. Back at the fire, Jonas looked up as Matthias returned. He didn't ask. Matthias just held out the bayonet. Jonas read the words. His lips parted, but he said nothing. They sat by the fire, the mist drawing closer, curling like fingers. Jonas finally spoke. "This place isn't dead." "No," Matthias said. "Something, or someone, is still walking it." He looked into the dark. "Or waiting." That night, the fog grew thick. The marsh whispered. Every sound echoed too long. Every silence stayed too deep. And somewhere, out in the distance, beyond firelight and reason, a single set of footprints waited to be found again. They reached the village just before dusk. It lay across a slope, scattered like drop seeds among fields of rye and early spring lilac. The stone path that led them in was cracked and moss-worn. No signs marked the entrance, and none were needed. Jonas unfolded the old map. "St. Linda," he said. "It's not on the new ones. But someone still lives here," Matthias replied, watching as 2 children chased a dog down a dirt path, their laughter fading as they spotted strangers. They ran inside, doors closing quietly behind them. It was a place that hadn't forgotten silence. The people were kind, nodding, offering fruit, bread, a seat near the well, but their eyes didn't linger. As if familiarity could invite something unwelcome. Only one man, stooped and mending a fence post, spoke with more than a glance. "If you want truth," he said, not looking up, "find Maria. She lives by the chapel. Still listens for footsteps." Maria's home sat just below the chapel hill, a cottage wrapped in ivy, its windows soft with the gold of the setting sun. She opened the door before they knocked. "I heard the boots," she said simply. "But they weren't his." She studied Matthias for a long moment, not judging, not questioning. Just remembering. "I was waiting for someone. Maybe it was you all along." She led them inside. The home was clean, simple. Worn wood, whitewashed walls, a scent of lavender and ash. On a shelf above the hearth, a portrait. A young man in old uniform, his face strikingly familiar. Beneath it, in a velvet-lined box, rested a silver medallion, the lily and crossed swords. Matthias stopped breathing for a heartbeat. Maria watched him gently. "My grandfather," she said. "He left with the others. I was just a girl when the letter came, saying nothing. Only that the unit never returned." She served them stew and bread. Her hands trembled when pouring tea, but her voice did not. Still, I ring the bell. Every Sunday. Because what if, one day, the hill hears him again? As night fell, they climbed the chapel hill with her. The structure was modest, stone blocks, moss-wrapped. But the bell tower still stood, and the bell above was black with age, its chain rusted but intact. Maria touched it with both hands. They say, if someone carries iron from that war, and that war only, the bell might answer. Matthias reached into his coat. He removed the bayonet, the one they'd found buried beneath the willow, etched with Ich bin Nacht. He set it at the base of the bell, on the worn wooden step. Then stepped back. Silence. A long silence. Wind stirred the lilac bushes. The chain creaked slightly, but no sound came from the bell. Then, just when Jonas shifted, ready to speak, it happened. Not a chime. Not a strike. Just a note. A whisper of bronze. A tone so soft it might have been imagined. But they all heard it. Maria pressed her hand to her lips. So he was still walking. Somewhere. Matthias looked up at the bell, eyes distant. Maybe he still is. On the way back, Maria stopped beside a small drawer. I kept something. Never knew why. But maybe it was for you. She handed Matthias a folded square of parchment, worn thin, but intact. It came by post. Just before they left. He opened it slowly. An old map segment, drawn by hand. A narrow pass through the mountains. A path that led farther south than any other charted route. Near the edge, beneath a hand-drawn symbol of a chapel, were scrawled words in firm, slanted ink. When ich nicht zurückkehre, gehe weiter. If I don't return, go on. Matthias ran his fingers across the line. The writing, he knew it. It matched the journal from the tower. Matched the hand that never finished the final sentence. That night, over candlelight, they sat together in her kitchen. Maria didn't ask for stories. She simply watched the fire, as if it were enough to finally share silence. Later, as they left, she stood by the doorway. She didn't wave. She only whispered, "Thank you." And in her stillness, there was peace. Back in their room, Jonas sat by the window, staring at the dark chapel tower above. "Do you think that sound really meant something?" he asked. Matthias unfolded the map again. His eyes didn't leave the ink. "I think someone wanted us to keep going." He folded the parchment. "The one she waited for, he may be gone." He looked out the window, where the stars began to pierce the dark. "But he isn't alone anymore." Morning came quietly and sank Linda. No birdsong, no bells, just the faint stirring of wind between wooden fences, and the slow rustling of leaves that hadn't yet decided whether to bloom or fall. The sky was pale gold, the kind that hinted at higher places. Matthias tightened the strap on his pack, eyes set not on the road ahead, but somewhere beneath his thoughts. Jonas checked the map, tracing their next path with a gloved finger. "The pass marked in the old segment from Maria's scroll, it runs here. A forgotten trade road. Steep and used, but still there." They left the village in silence, their steps absorbed by moss and memory. The path narrowed into a broken trail, winding through thin trees and outcrops of stone. The incline grew steeper. Air turned sharper. Somewhere far ahead, the mountains waited, watching. Matthias walked slower now. Not from weariness, but from weight. It was no longer about reaching a place. It was about understanding it. And being understood by it. By midday, they reached the ridge, a weathered plateau tucked between two arms of rock. At its center stood a small stone structure, half buried in ivy and silence. A chapel. Or what remained of one. Its walls were cracked but holding. A narrow arch marked the doorway, and above it, faintly chiseled, 1636. Below, nearly erased by time, LG. Jonas ran his fingers over the initials. "Lager got fried," he murmured. "A field camp. Makeshift sanctuary." Matthias stepped through the threshold. The air inside was cold, but not dead. Light streamed through holes in the roof, cutting columns through dust. The scent was a mixture of stone, old wax, and something unnameable, not decay, not incense, but memory distilled. He stepped toward a ledge near what had once been a window. Something rested there, wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly. A saddlebag. Weathered, scuffed, but intact. The buckle was rusted, but beneath the grime, he saw it, an engraving. Barely visible, but enough. The crest of his family. He didn't speak. He simply opened it. Inside, a silver coin dated 1635, faded scraps of paper, the ink smudged beyond recognition, and tucked in a pouch, a copper capsule. Matthias handed it to Jonas with trembling fingers. Jonas twisted it open, slowly. Inside, a folded strip of parchment, creased and dry. He read aloud. If this road is found, continue it. From my sword, only shadow shall remain. But let my name find silence. Matthias sat down, hard. It's him, he said, voice thin. That's his hand. He signed our family's founding charter with it. I've seen it in books since I could read. Jonas nodded slowly. And now you see, this isn't a hunt for steel. It's a voice. One no one heard, but that refused to vanish. He reached into the bottom of the bag. Another item lay hidden, folded parchment, dry and stiff. He opened it gently. Charcoal sketch. A hill. A tree. One tree. Gnarled bare. At its base, a stone. Below the image, words pressed in dark strokes. Sign of the nights in shadow. Last station, where the tree stands above the stone. Jonas froze. I know this. He looked up, eyes wide. The windless hollow. Dai Windus Senkei. It's almost a myth. A place where nothing grows, except one tree. The locals say it feeds on silence. On remembrance. Matthias flipped the parchment. On the reverse, a final line, handwritten alone. Der Baum vergisst nicht. The tree does not forget. They sat in silence for a long time. The saddlebag between them. Jonas ran a finger along the medallion crest. They left pieces behind. Not to be found by anyone, only by someone who knew what to listen for. Matthias nodded. Or someone they hoped would come one day. Outside, the clouds began to break. Sunlight filtered through in beams, faint, golden, like a breath between centuries. Matthias held the saddlebag in both hands. Not as a relic. As something living. And ahead, somewhere in the folds of rock and wind, a hollow waited. Where a tree still stood. Still remembering. The descent from the past was strangely quiet. Not silent, not yet, but hushed, as though the very landscape were drawing breath, waiting to speak. Light faded faster than it should have, despite the sun still hanging in the sky behind them. Talon Morgan, Jonas said, gazing down into the wide hollow below. The valley without morning. It stretched out before them, a basin of silver-tinged grass and stone. No trees within its heart. No birds above. Just stillness, wrapped in a cool, metallic breeze that didn't move anything. It simply was. They say the light never quite arrives here, Jonas added. It's always this, in-between. And the chapel? Matthias asked. In the center. If it's still there. As they crossed the threshold into the valley, it became clear. Nothing grew closer than a half-mile from the center. The earth itself seemed to resist life, but not in death. In memory. The moss underfoot gleamed faintly, pale and silvery, like frost that didn't melt. The air grew colder, and every breath tasted like stone and silence. And then the tree. Alone. Gnarled. Twisted, as if shaped by centuries of storms. But here, no wind blew. No branches swayed. It stood over a flat slab of stone, half swallowed by moss. Not random. Too clean. Too precise. A foundation, Jonas murmured. Chapel stone. He knelt beside it, running a hand along the edges. This place held something sacred. But not anymore. Not in stone, Matthias said. He looked up. Maybe in memory. Night approached like a curtain lowered gently by unseen hands. They lit their lamps and sat quietly, close to the tree, as shadows pooled in the valley's low places. Then it changed. The air thickened. Not with fear, but with presence. Mist began to gather, not rolling in, but rising, as if exhaled by the ground. And through it, a shape emerged. At first, it was just suggestion. Then outline. Walls. A frame. An archway. Glass that caught no firelight, but shimmered nonetheless. A chapel. Not built. Not placed. Remembered. Jonas stood slowly. Do you see it? Matthias didn't answer. He was already walking forward. He passed through the threshold, where no wall truly stood, but his body knew it. He felt the shift. The temperature changed. The air dried. Inside was not an illusion, it was an impression. A space that once was, and still waited to be again. And there, at what might have been an altar, something rested on the cold slab. A fragment. Steel, blackened, fractured. He lifted it gently. A piece of a sword, just the tip of a fuller, the break jagged and old. Etched into the metal, Gr. He exhaled, a long, shaking breath. Gerhard Reichenau. His voice cracked on the name. My ancestor. Jonas stood beside the invisible door. He didn't step in, only watched. This place, he whispered. It never left. Matthias traced the stone with his hand. Words, nearly gone, were carved into the surface beneath the shard. Hier endet der Marsch, nicht der Name. Here ends the march, not the name. And then, a noise. Soft. A step? A scrape? Matthias turned. Across the stone field, half veiled in mist, stood a silhouette. Tall. Still. Human. It did not move. It only watched. Jonas lifted his lamp. The flame flickered. Then died. So did Matthias's. Darkness took them, full, sudden. But not empty. Then a sound. Clang. Metal on stone. Sharp. Resounding. And then, stillness. When the lamps returned, the figure was gone. But beneath the tree, something remained. A piece of old cloth, torn, weighted with age. Wrapped around a sliver of parchment. Jonas opened it slowly. Gold ink, delicate and precise. A new fragment of the old map. Another path. Another step. They didn't speak that night. Not because they were afraid. Because they didn't want to break the silence the valley had offered them, trusted them with. At dawn, Matthias sat beneath the tree, the broken blade in his lap. I thought I had to find it whole, he said quietly. To restore something. To bring it back. He looked at the steel in his palm. But it was broken. Like him. Like the rest. And still. I found it. Jonas sat beside him. You didn't find a weapon, he said. You found a name. And now it lives again. Matthias closed his eyes, and for the first time, there was peace behind them. The chapel shimmered once more. Not fully formed. Not yet. But closer. And waiting. The map fragment, inked in fading gold, led them along a steep trail that wound between jagged cliffs. Below, in a hidden pocket of the land, lay something marked only as Schwegerlof. The silent flow, Jonas said, reading it aloud as they reached the edge. An old border river. Matthias narrowed his eyes. There's no sound. And indeed, not even birds called here. No wind. No movement. Before them stretched a narrow body of water. But it didn't flow. It didn't ripple. It simply lay there. Still as glass. They approached cautiously. The river gleamed like polished obsidian beneath the pale sky, reflecting clouds that didn't drift and trees that didn't move. Matthias bent down, plucked a twig, and gently dropped it onto the surface. It didn't sink. It didn't move. It simply remained. Held. As if the river remembered its duty, and refused to let anything pass. Jonas crouched beside it, whispering. This isn't water. Not anymore. Matthias looked over his shoulder. Then what is it? Jonas ran his hand across a stone post embedded in the soil, part of what looked like an old pier, long decayed. Memory, he said. Memory given form. He wiped away moss from the rotted wood, carved deep into the grain. Zen came in. Keener Jing. 10 came. None left. Matthias stared across the water's surface, then down into its shallows, and saw metal. Beneath the surface, dulled by time but strangely intact, lay what looked like a fragment of armor. He rolled up his sleeves, waded in up to his knees. The water was freezing, but not deep. Jonas joined him. Together they pulled the piece free, a cuirass, its leather straps long rotted. Upon its chest, a crest. The same crossed swords and lily they had seen on the medallions, the sword shard, the chapel. And there was more. A helm. A broken blade. A pauldron. Bits of woven cloth still clinging to chain. And carefully arranged, not buried, not discarded. Preserved. Jonas whispered, almost reverently. This isn't a grave. Matthias nodded. No. It's a choice. He knelt again, pulling something small from the water, a pin, bronze and still sharp. Etched GR. He closed his hand around it. His breath shook. Then something else caught the light. Another hilt. Shorter. Slimmer. On it, 2 worn letters, JW. Matthias turned, silent. Jonas saw them. And froze. My grandfather once showed me a letter, he said quietly. A return address with those initials. J. Wenzel. I thought it was a myth. Matthias handed him the hilt. Maybe your family walked with mine. Jonas didn't take it. But he nodded. I think they walked for the same reason. They sat on the riverbank, surrounded by the objects the water had refused to consume. Maybe they didn't fall, Jonas said. Maybe they chose to stop here. To leave their steel behind. To unburden themselves, Matthias added. He opened his pack, removed his canteen, the one he'd carried since the start, and gently set it on the water. It didn't sink. But slowly, it moved. Forward. Drifting. As if pulled by something that wasn't current, but invitation. Jonas watched, eyes wide. They're still moving. Matthias nodded. And they wanted someone to follow. Not to fight. To remember. They didn't take the armor. Not the sword. Not the helm. Only 2 things, the pin of GR, and the hilt of JW. Memory, made light enough to carry. As they climbed the path again, the river vanished behind the rise. But it stayed with them. A place that chose stillness. So others could move on. At the crest, Matthias stopped. I'm not looking for a blade anymore, he said. Not really. Jonas waited. I'm looking for what it stood for, Matthias finished. For what they chose in the end. Jonas placed a hand on his shoulder. And now you carry it. Not in steel, but in steps. And stories. And silence that never forgot. The last stretch of the journey unfolded in near silence. No villages. No signs. Even the birds had grown quiet, as though the land itself had nothing more to say until they arrived. The final fragment of the map, stitched to the old cloak they'd found near the chapel that wasn't, led southeast through narrowing valleys and into the edge of a forgotten range. Moss overtook the rocks. Wind whispered and then fell away entirely. And then, even the whisper was gone. Jonas stopped first. This is it, he said. Matthias nodded, though he didn't need to be told. They had reached it. A glade opened before them, quiet, untouched, wrapped in a light that felt filtered through memory. In the center stood a single tree. Ancient. Its bark dark as iron, branches stretching like arms raised not in plea, but in offering. And there, embedded deep into the trunk, a sword. Or rather, what remained of one. Only the hilt and the first few inches of blade were visible. The rest had been claimed by the tree, embraced by it, grown into it. It didn't pierce the tree. It belonged to it. Matthias stepped forward slowly. The hilt was dark, wrapped in worn leather, bound by 2 bronze rings. On the cross guard, unmistakable. His family's crest. "This is it," he whispered. Jonas remained a step behind, silent. Matthias reached out, fingers hovering. The bark was warm beneath his hand. Living. He didn't pull. He didn't even try. He simply stood. "All this time," Matthias said, "I dreamed of finding it. Of taking it home. Proving that our name wasn't forgotten." He looked down. "But I see it now. The blade was not a ruin. It was a root. A part of the land. Of the story. No longer a weapon. But memory planted and grown. If I take it," he said, "I make it steel again." He turned to Jonas. "But if I leave it, it stays what it became. Something better." Jonas didn't answer. He didn't need to. Matthias reached to his belt. Unclipped the broken sword shard he had carried from the monastery. He knelt beside the tree and placed it beneath the roots. A returning. A quiet offering. "I brought this from the silence," he said. "Now I give it back to where silence breathes." The wind stirred. Or perhaps the tree did. Above them, leaves rustled, though the air remained still. And then, a crack. A thin line opened on the tree's bark. Something dropped. A scroll. Bound in twine, aged and dry. Matthias picked it up. His hands didn't tremble. He unrolled it. Ink faded but legible. Not a decree. Not a warning. Just words. "We did not vanish. We chose to remain. Where silence preserves what steel cannot." Below 10 names. And 1 Gr. Jonas stepped beside him. Together they looked at the sword. The tree. The glade. No graves. No monuments. Just presence. Just peace. Matthias breathed in, and felt the weight shift. Not vanish. But settle. "I thought I'd be carrying a legacy home," he said. "Turns out, it was never meant to move." Jonas nodded. "Some truths grow deeper when they stay rooted." They stood for a while. Not speaking. Listening. The tree said nothing. But somehow, they heard it. The sun broke through the canopy above, casting shafts of light that turned dust into gold. It felt like stained glass, cast not by a chapel's window, but by the world itself. Before leaving, Matthias turned once more to the blade. He didn't touch it. He didn't bow. He simply whispered, "Not forgotten." And the tree, or perhaps the wind, seemed to answer in kind. They walked away slowly, feet soft on the moss that felt more like memory than ground. When they reached the edge of the glade, Jonas spoke. "History doesn't need witnesses." Matthias looked at him. "It needs someone who remembers." Jonas continued. Matthias smiled, eyes on the path ahead. "And someone willing to leave it where it belongs." And with that they moved forward, not toward another quest, but toward life. They remained at the glade's edge for a long while. The tree, the blade, the silence, all of it seemed to shift the air around them. Not in movement, but in weight. Matthias hadn't spoken since reading the scroll. He stood beneath the branches, hands still resting on the bark. A breath held in eternity. Jonas found something beside the roots. A new object. Not there before. A small wooden plaque, freshly carved, the scent of shavings still rising from the soil. He brushed the surface, and read aloud. "He who came for the blade, found memory. He who came for glory, found silence. He who left the sword, did not return. But he did not die." They said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The walk back began in soft footsteps, almost unintentional, as though either of them quite wanted to leave, but both understood they must. Through the still forest, over quiet moss, they retraced their journey. But the places they passed, the glade, the silent river, the stone chapel, the valley without morning, all felt changed. Not because they were different. Because they were. Matthias walked slower. Not from fatigue. But because with every step, something inside him became quieter. And stronger. Just before sunset, as they passed into the lower forest near the monastery path, Matthias stopped. Jonas turned. He wasn't surprised. "I'm not going back," Matthias said simply. Jonas waited, giving him space. "I thought this journey would bring me something," Matthias continued. "A weapon. A title. Proof that I came from something." He reached to his belt and unclipped the cartridge pouch he'd worn since the first day. "But that was never what I needed." He set it gently on a flat stone beside the path. "I found peace," he said. "Back there, in the glade. Under that tree. I found who I no longer want to be." He smiled softly, not with pride, but with understanding. "If anyone asks," he said, "tell them I didn't get lost. I just stayed, where silence remembers me." He looked once toward the monastery, then turned toward the trees, and stepped into the green, as if the forest had always known he would return to it. Jonas didn't follow. He didn't call out. He just stood, and watched until Matthias disappeared between the trunks. Jonas reached the monastery alone. Nothing had changed in its stone halls, in the scent of wax and wood and parchment. But the silence, now, was familiar. Not empty. Not lonely. Just right. He entered the library, where it all began. The table where the first map had opened. The first question had been asked. He found a blank journal, sat down, and wrote. "We walked a road not found on any map. But it was real. Not because it brought treasure, but because it brought peace." He dipped the quill again, and wrote carefully. "If you have found these words, don't look for a sword. Look for a tree. It remembers." He signed. J.W. Closed the book. Placed it on a shelf without a label. A space meant not to be marked, but found. When the time was right. Far away, under sun-dappled leaves, Matthias sat at the base of the tree. His eyes were closed, not from sleep, but peace. He didn't wait for anything. He didn't look back. He simply was. A part of something now beyond names or stories. In the village of St. Linda, Maria stood beside the chapel bell. She rang at once. Not for hope. Not for mourning. But for gratitude. A single, soft chime that echoed through the hills. A sound that said someone came home. Years later, a boy in the monastery would pull a book without a name from a quiet shelf. He'd open it. Read the first line. And understand only a little. But enough. Enough to want to walk a path not drawn. Not to find a weapon. But to learn how to leave one behind.